Welcome to BICOM's weekly Hadiyun podcast. This is episode 25. We have reached the quarter century and we're absolutely delighted to have with us a very special guest this week, Tal Shalev, the political reporter from Walla News. Tal, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So really we want to discuss with you, Tal, as one of Israel's best sort of political commentators. We thought we would sort of try and analyze the week in the life of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I've seen a lot of photos and footage this week, what looks like Prime Minister Netanyahu suspiciously on a campaign trail, meeting lots of supporters, adulating crowds, celebrating his 69th birthday among friends. Is this the start of his campaign? How do you see it?
Well, first of all, it's I wouldn't say it's necessarily the start of his campaign because, a politician's campaign actually starts the day after the elections. But and Netanyahu is constantly in a campaign, and he's specifically constantly in a campaign in the past 2 years or so because he is facing a very, I would say, perhaps a very grim legal future. So he has been campaigning very hard, and seeing him going down to the cities and going around Israel is quite rare, but that should be attributed to the local elections, which are going to happen next week, next Tuesday. Everyone will be going out to vote their mayors, and Netanyahu has basically been using the past 2 or 3 weeks for heavy political support for some of his party, the Likud party's candidates. By the way, he's not the only one. This is what people have been doing for the past 2 weeks. For instance, this week, the Knesset was empty because most of the MKs were out around the country helping their candidates in the municipal elections. But the other part of the action of the answer to your question is yes. Netanyahu has definitely intensified his campaign mode and definitely seems that we are on the verge of elections. Netanyahu says that he hasn't decided yet, but the common assumption is that after these municipal regional elections next week, next Tuesday, then things will start to roll out and the whole political scene will become a bit more clear. And the common assumption is that we are on our way to early elections somewhere in the beginning of 2019, in the first half of 2019. The common assumption, and this is said by most of Netanyahu's partners, is that Netanyahu wants to have early elections as soon as possible, and that part of the reasoning for this timing has to do with his legal problems, and that should be the other clock that we should always be referring to. And that clock has also started ticking this week a bit faster because basically the police has concluded all of Netanyahu's investigations. So we should always remember that there's another clock ticking with Netanyahu, and it's probably the more dramatic one, and it's also the one that most politicians cannot calculate because that is the legal and criminal clock which is ticking, and that also started to click much faster this week. The police have basically announced, or are on their way to announce, about to announce, that they have concluded all investigations of Netanyahu, meaning that in the upcoming weeks, all of the police files, there are 3 police files investigated against Netanyahu, all of these will be passed on to the Attorney General. And the Attorney General will now have to decide if to indict Netanyahu. And this whole process is a process which casts a very big doubt over Netanyahu these days. And the common assumption is that he would like to go to elections before the Attorney General concludes or decides if to indict Netanyahu.
And there was a leak this week, wasn't there, or a briefing into the papers that said that the Attorney General would likely make that decision within the first 3 months of 2019. And that seemed like a much shorter time frame than perhaps we thought earlier. So really he has to have had an election even earlier by what sort of end of February? What would you say?
I have to say that first of all, there are a lot of speculations on what is Netanyahu's defense line and how is he going to deal with this and what is his strategy. And I am not sure how many of them are based and how many of them are actually being discussed within Netanyahu's chambers and in his meetings with his lawyers. I do know to say that such a decision, such an announcement by the Attorney General, first of all, does not necessarily mean anything, because the Attorney General's first announcement will say that will give his decision about an indictment, but it will still be conditioned on a hearing. And the final decision is only after Netanyahu and his lawyers get a hearing in front of the Attorney General. So the final process will still be taking time. And it is not necessarily, and there's also another thing that should be said, it's not necessarily bad for Netanyahu to have some of his legal and criminal problems part of the campaign. Because if you look at his popularity in the past 2 years, since all of these criminal troubles began, his popularity has only spiked. You see a clear connection, a clear trend. The more Netanyahu got involved, the more we knew about alleged bribery cases or alleged manipulation of media, the more popular he got. So Netanyahu is basically waging and is about to wage, in any case, a campaign which is based on a lot of delegitimization to these investigations and to these inquiries and to the whole process, because it has shown, he has seen in the past 2 years that it actually has electoral merit. So all of these calculations we should take them with a grain of salt, because we are talking not on a political level necessarily, but also on a legal level. And Netanyahu is playing between the clocks.
So let's just talk about what happened yesterday, which is this extraordinary moment where Prime Minister Netanyahu is at his birthday party, was it in the Prime Minister's office, and he starts to talk about this secret deal that he thinks is being cooked up by President Rivlin and potentially Gideon Saar to have a situation where Prime Minister Netanyahu wins the election, and if that happens, Rivlin will not ask Prime Minister Netanyahu to form a government, but would ask Gideon Saar instead. I mean, where did this extraordinary revelation come from?
Okay, well, this extraordinary revelation has been floating around for a few weeks. For a few weeks, we've been hearing some of Netanyahu's associates gossip. They've been gossiping that Gideon Saar is getting stronger, and that we should start with some background. Gideon Saar used to be the number one most popular minister in the Likud, and he was also had very, very bad relationship with Netanyahu, who has always seen him as a threat. And in 2015, Gideon Saar announced he is leaving politics, only to come back after a year and a half. And in the past year and a half, he has been rallying support for the next Likud primary. But he's been very, very cautious not to annoy Netanyahu, because it is well known that he is like the big devil for the Netanyahu family. Netanyahu sees him as a threat, and as a threat, he would like to eliminate him as early as possible. So for weeks, Netanyahu's associates and aides have been whispering that Gideon Saar is getting stronger and that Gideon Saar is plotting to have his candidates elected to the Likud list. So the day after Netanyahu is indicted, he will be able to take over, and a lot of different conspiracy theories about what Gideon Saar is plotting to do. But they didn't really succeed to convince anyone, because it wasn't published anywhere. On Wednesday, yesterday morning, Israel Hayom, a newspaper which is highly identified with Netanyahu, highly supportive of Netanyahu, did publish the story and presented it as a plot, a joint plot of Gideon Sa'ar and Reuven Rivlin, another longtime rival of Netanyahu, basically outlining a scenario which, frankly, is very unlikable, and since which basically it cast a doubt on both Rivlin and Sa'ar, as if they are trying to oust Netanyahu from the inside. This is behavior which in the Likud is considered highly. Loyalty is the most important thing in the Likud.
So he's trying to paint Sa'ar as a kind of disloyal traitor and paint himself as the victim.
Exactly. And he's trying just to, he is apparently afraid from Sa'ar, and he's afraid that Sa'ar will take advantage of the day after the indictment, for instance, or the day after the Attorney General announces an indictment. So he wants to eliminate this threat now, and also to paint it in advance as something that is anti, that is betrayal, and this could harm Gideon Sa'ar in the next election dramatically.
And presumably, I mean, the big challenge for Gideon Sa'ar is the moment when elections are called and there are primaries for the Likud list. That's the moment where he has to really generate interest and popularity, and I suppose that's what this kind of intervention is targeted at.
Yes, indeed, and but it's not only about the primary; it's also about the day after. One could envision a scenario in which Netanyahu is elected, as in which the Likud, as we see now in the polls, does indeed win the next election by a wide margin, and Netanyahu is elected prime minister, and while he is trying to form a coalition, the Attorney General will announce he decided to indict him. So Netanyahu is just preparing for the scenarios. In that respect, someone told me yesterday, someone who knows Netanyahu very well, he told me this means that Netanyahu, he's not worried about the elections, he's worried about the day after. And the assumption is that Netanyahu will only go out to election when he knows he is safe the day after. Because if he doesn't know that he's safe, then he has no reason to risk his seat, even though there's no apparent risk to his seat at the moment. But Netanyahu is well known as a very cautious, some say even paranoid person, and this is probably what has led him to become what he has come, the ability to identify threats and to eliminate them in advance.
Right. So if we could try and just touch on three other issues that I think also were discussed a lot this week and have links to sort of whether Prime Minister Netanyahu is seen as sort of doing a good or bad job. I mean, firstly, I just wanted to get your thoughts on, the latest attack from Gaza with a Grad missile yesterday, and then the Israeli army responding. That this issue is not going away, but there doesn't really seem to be anything that Prime Minister Netanyahu can actually do about it. He's hit from both sides, from sort of Bennett and Lieberman in his coalition, and also from others like Lapid, who are all criticizing his handling. I mean, does this really affect the Israeli public's perception of Netanyahu as the security prime minister?
I think it does affect Netanyahu. I think that Gaza is the thorn that Netanyahu will have in the next election. As you said, I think he's probably mostly concerned from the criticism within his own base. I mean, the criticism from within the government and within the cabinet. We have both Defense Minister Lieberman and Naftali Bennett on the record with very harsh criticism of the policy in Gaza. Netanyahu does not have a good option, a good way out of this. Besides the fact that he is credited by many inside the Israeli public, even his rivals, that will give him credit for the fact that he does not rush to launch any fast wars. And this is something, if we go back to the process before Protective Edge, Netanyahu waited. There was constant rocket attacks on Israel before Netanyahu launched Protective Edge. So there has to be a level of a level that of public acceptance also for Netanyahu to feel confidence enough to launch a wide-scale operation in Gaza. Netanyahu does not want to launch a wide-scale operation in Gaza. He does not want to be entangled at Gaza at all. He does not like this harming his security image, but he can at least claim that he's trying to maintain a sensible and responsible and restrained policy. And as long as he has the army behind him on his side, the IDF, he will be okay. The big concern is that because we are already in this election campaign feeling that there are too much politics that go into the decision-making rooms. And the risk is that this could eventually push Netanyahu to eventually decide that he does need to take a more active approach, a more violent approach towards what's happening at Gaza. But at the moment, Netanyahu is doing his best to preserve calm and to try and give the arrangement attempts of the situation, to try and give them space.
Right. And just finally, there was a big issue at the beginning of the week where King Abdullah in Jordan said he would no longer be renewing next year the lease of this 250-acre area of land that was given, sovereignty was given back to Jordan in 1994 as part of the peace treaty, but Jordan then allowed Israel to lease the land back. And I guess the way we saw it was, there was the issue that King Abdullah is kind of making clear that, he wants this part of the peace treaty to end, which made it look like, perhaps people in Jordan are not as favorable towards Israel or elements of the peace treaty. But I think there was also criticism of the government and diplomatic machine in Israel that, why did they not do more to stop this? Why did they not see this coming? Why could they not manage the relationship with Jordan better? There's a Prime Minister Netanyahu element there in that he's obviously the acting foreign minister. He's met Abdullah, not that many times. I just wondered how you saw that. Does that affect? Does that really lead to, I suppose, reasonable criticism that the Prime Minister should have managed the issue earlier? Or is this just a kind of domestic Jordanian political issue that has to be managed at a later date?
I think the answer is probably somewhere, the answer to your question is probably both. This is definitely a domestic issue, and it should come to no surprise to any Israeli that the peace with Jordan is cold. It's been cold forever, and it's especially been cold in the past few years, and especially since last year in the embassy attack last summer, the whole Magnometer crisis on Temple Mount. So yes, the relationship with Jordan is cold, but on the other hand, I feel that Jerusalem, or at least the officials in Jerusalem, and the relationship is cold, and whatever is happening now with these clauses of the peace agreement would have happened anyway, probably. Of course, Netanyahu is being attacked by some of his political rivals, speculating that if Netanyahu would have preserved an open line with the kingdom, with the Hashemite kingdom, or if he had if he had a better Palestinian policy, then the peace treaty would be untouched. But that, I think, is A, highly speculative, and B, I don't think that is a criticism that actually touches Netanyahu. The reality today, in which Netanyahu is considered and perceived as much more. It's not only about security; it's about statesmanship. His relationship with President Trump and his relationship with other world leaders makes it very, very difficult, including, by the way, King Abdullah, makes it very difficult for his rivals to actually attack him on foreign policy. And just to talk about the relationship with Jordan, I was under the impression that both the diplomats and Netanyahu's people are trying to manage the situation. They're just trying to do it far away from the cameras. And this is not new, also not new for the relationship between Israel and Jordan. The most strongest links between Jerusalem and Amman are not out in the open. They're definitely behind the scenes, if they have to do with security cooperation, intelligence cooperation, and most importantly, energy cooperation. And there are many strategic assets to these relationships. So I feel that the decision in Jerusalem, the both policy and political decision, was not to make this into a big crisis with Jordan, but rather to try and handle this via back channel. And there is still a year ahead, presumably, in which the decision could be reversed. I don't think the king will be reversing his decision, but I think that the relationship will contain it. And because of the other pillars of the relationship, I think they are much more important when you level them one.
That is very, very interesting. So Tal, thank you so much. We've covered a lot of ground there, but really, really great to have you with us. And thank you for answering all the questions.
You're welcome. Thank you.